Good afternoon and welcome. I am Annie Lung. On behalf of the Intel Alumni Network, we are grateful for your presence here today to join in community with us for this global gathering in remembrance of Andy Grove. Please take a moment to complete the poll on the bottom of your screen. We're very interested to know when you first met Andy. The poll will close once the program begins. Our Intel alumnus moderator for today is Dave House. Panelists are Eva Grove, Les Vadasz, Gerry Parker, Jack Carsten, Tom Dunlap, and Leslie Dorrison. And here's Dave House.
Today, we're going to focus on remembering Andy Grove. This is the Intel Alumni Network webinar. It's been 5 years since Andy passed away. There's been a lot written about Andy in the past. He has been about his work as a technologist, his work as an operation person, his work as a leader, a CEO, a philanthropist, many things that he's done. But today we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Andy Grove, the person. Now, do we have the survey results available? Okay, very good. So most of the people here started in the 1980s, some in the 70s and some in the 90s, and a few people worked there never. So we have a number of attendees today. In fact, we had more than 2 to the 10th people register. So that's more bits than there were in the 1103, more than 1,024. So I'm going to ask some questions of our panelists today, and then we're going to hopefully go on and have time for questions that you'll be able to enter. We're scheduled to go from 12 to 1 here in California. But we're going to leave this open until 1:30 to allow additional time for questions if you're able to join us. First of all, I would like to welcome Eva Grove as our first panelist. Hello, Eva.
Hi. Hi, everybody.
So
it's great to see so many people.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd like to start out by asking you, how did you first meet Andy and what was your first impression?
Well, let me see. We were both very, very young. I realized that we were younger than most of my grandchildren at that point. In 1957, Andy was less than 6 months out of Hungary, and we each had gotten a job at the Maplewood Hotel. I would be a waitress, and he would be a busboy. So I arrived and their guys were already there. And as the hotel bus picked us up, and as we arrived, there was this gaggle of boys standing around, eagerly waiting for girls to arrive. And there he was, and he was just one of many. But as we shook hands to say hello, it was just like it was a great handshake. It just felt really good. And then the next day, I was at lunch, and I saw a table. He was one of the people there, and there was space, but there was no chair. So I kind of stood around helplessly, and I said, could I join them? And Andy noticed there was no chair, and he ran and got me a chair, which was kind of nice. And from there on, we just kind of spent a lot of time together at the resort and kept seeing each other when we went back to New York.
Great. So tell us about your wedding.
A wedding. Well, let's see. Well, before our wedding, before we married, Andy had to ask my father for my hand in marriage. And he was a good sport, he did it. And my father, I don't know, he asked him various questions on it. But one thing he said to him is this, she's older than you. And says, a man at 50 is a vigorous man, but a woman at 50, So this story was told many, many, many times. anyway, so the wedding came along. We had a little wedding. We had a reception at Howard Johnson on Queens Boulevard. And was mostly my family and family friends. Andy didn't have that many people. He had an aunt and an uncle that he lived with, and a couple of friends from Hungary, a couple of friends from City College. And it was a nice reception, but we kind of had to muddle through it, and we wanted to get going. So when we left, we started driving upstate for our honeymoon. My mother had lent us a car. We went to the Finger Lakes. It sounded just like a really cool thing. And I think we had a day with sunshine, but then it just poured and poured and poured until we decided we'd go back home. We got back home, and a friend of my mother's was very helpful. And she said, well, why would you go to the Finger Lakes in June? You should go to Virginia Beach. So we were very nice. We were very obedient. We went to Virginia Beach. And we got there. It was early afternoon. People were on the beach. They were tanned. It was wonderful. The next morning, it poured. And it didn't stop. So we ended up going back. We were happy enough. We were just happy to be married.
So let me ask you a question. You may choose to answer or not, but can you tell us something about Andy that we would not know from work?
Well, let's see. Maybe a couple of things. When he was late in high school, he got exposed to opera, and he was absolutely hooked. And he actually started taking singing lessons, and he sang opera, and he loved to imagine himself on stage. And another one that you might not know. What did I say? I kind of wrote something down. Oh yeah, he loved roller coasters. And a highlight of his life was in high school when the father of one of the classmates worked at the amusement park in Budapest. And they had to try out, apparently you have to try out the roller coaster before you let people on. And they needed ballast. So this fellow took the whole class to the amusement park, and they spent the day on the roller coaster. And it was the best day of his life.
So you actually traveled with Andy some in the beginning when Intel was still small. Do you have a story to tell us about that?
I sure do. We went to Penang back in the 70s. Intel was building its first foreign plant, and so it was a very exciting thing. And so we were supposed to go visit the plant that was still in construction, but there was something to be seen. It was the monsoon season. It had rained quite a bit, and it turned out the road to the plant wasn't paved yet. It was muddy, very muddy. Our car got stuck, hopelessly stuck in the mud. We ended up having to get out of the car, took our shoes off, traipsed through the mud, and there is a picture somewhere.
I think they're showing the picture of people pushing his car right.
By the next morning, that road was graveled over. That's how efficient they were.
Very good. So, yes, go ahead.
Anyway, it was also a very big deal in Penang because they didn't have that many. They weren't that popular as a place for plants. I think we were the second plant to go there. And so there were reporters that came out to interview Andy and Keith, and they held a press conference, and it was a really exciting thing because they weren't used to these things yet. It wasn't like later on when it was just like one of the things you do. So that was very fun. It was a fun trip.
So we all knew Andy for his aggressive and risky behavior or activities, the chances that he took with Intel as a company to be aggressive and move forward. Did you find him that way in his personal life?
Well, there is one time, no, not really. So I remember one time when we were going for a bike ride. We were on a bike ride with Karen Alter, I think, and we did our usual loop around Alpine Road. And at one point we had to cross Alpine Road, and the light tends to be kind of it takes a long time to change. So the light was about to change. Karen and I went across, and when we got to the other side, we had to wait because Andy was not going to cross when the light was about to change. He was going to play safe. He waited for the light to change and have a full light to cross. So Karen Alter turned to me and she said, she shook her head. She said, "For a man who takes such chances at work, he's sure cautious."
So one extra question. Were you happy or sad when he shaved off his mustache?
Was I happy or sad when?
He shaved off his mustache, when he ditched the mustache.
I think I was kind of happy. But actually, I think when he did it, he came out and, he's hanging out. And it took me a while to notice. He just was waiting for.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eva. I'm going to move on next to Les Vadasz. Les knew Andy for more time than any of us at work and anyone except for Eva. So I'm sort of following the timeline of Andy Grove here. But I'm going to ask you, Les, when did you first meet Andy and what was your impression?
Well, I joined the Fairchild R&D in March 1964. And I clearly remember, not the day, but roughly some early March, that I was having lunch in the Fairchild cafeteria, where when a guy with dark, heavy rimmed glasses walks up to me and starts speaking Hungarian, which was kind of startling because while I was in the US for a few years by that time, nobody ever spoke to me in Hungarian in the US. So that was Andy Grove. And so I have the most surprising thing about that encounter to me in retrospect is that may be the only time in our 50+ year history that he and I spoke in Hungarian to each other. You know, I remember speaking Hungarian to Andy's parents, but Andy and I, from then on, we always conversed in English. But that was the first time we met.
So you shortly after that, or not too long after that, wound up going to Intel, and you were right there at the beginning. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I was coming home from Montreal. My wife, Judy, was picking me up at the airport. And she was very excited telling me the news that Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce left Fairchild, and Andy was joining them, and they want to talk to me. Well, it was very exciting, of course, and to make the long story short, Intel started, I joined Intel, but it was very clear that Intel was started by Bob and Gordon, and Andy was the first employee that they hired. So by any measure, he was employee number 3. Well, once we started, we got badge numbers, and I noticed I got employee number 3. So assumed that, well, maybe Bob and Gordon didn't get any employee numbers, and Andy was employee number one, and the matter was settled in my mind, and didn't care about it. Until several years later, I remember at a party at Ron Whittier's home. And so what do engineers do at parties? They compare badge numbers, right? So we compared badge numbers. Somebody said, oh, I'm 27. The other said, oh, I'm 14. And I said, well, I'm 3. And everybody was going, ooh, you're 3. And I saw Andy was sitting there, and I just innocently turned to him and said, and what is your badge number? He turns to me, and says, I'm number 4, you son of a bitch.
Well, that gives you some insight into Andy right there, doesn't it? So you had a relationship with Andy that went beyond work and went to outside of Intel as well. So can you tell us a little bit about Andy not at work?
Well, our family did a lot of fun things together. We went to ski a lot, primarily in the Sierras, but also to other places. One of the frustrating thing about Andy was that although he didn't have any more talent, I thought, than I did, he became much better than I did in skiing just because he wanted to be better, and he was focusing on it. He was disciplined with it, and we started roughly around the same time, but pretty soon he was, negotiating the hills safely while I was basically a crash waiting to happen. And that was the same thing in other things, whether it's playing tennis or everything else. He just focused on it, and he got better. But we had some very nice family time together, and good memories.
I understand there was a time when he was a little off on his risk-taking with you and your family. Can you tell us that story?
The what? I'm sorry?
The story about when Andy was took a little more risk than he intended to, and the results didn't turn out the way that he wanted.
Oh, yeah. Andy and Eva came over to our home in the hills area near Los Altos. And I don't remember what was the occasion, but I know that my son, he was in junior high school, and he had this little scooter. And that little scooter was pretty small, even for, it was motorized scooter, pretty small even for somebody of middle school age. And Andy wanted to ride it. Well, Andy trying to get on that little scooter, his knees were almost 90 degrees to the scooter. It was so low, but Andy wanted to do it, so he did it. So he drives up the driveway and then suddenly disappears. And turns out he disappeared. He crashed into the bushes on the side of the road, which was really a riot until we realized that we had to go to the emergency room to patch him up. So,
maybe that's why he was so cautious in crossing the street on his bike. Okay, thank you, Les. Really appreciate your insights. You had such a special relationship with Andy. The next person is Gerry Parker, and I would like to bring Gerry up. Gerry started much earlier than many of us, other than Les, and I'm kind of following the sequence here. But if we could get Gerry up on the screen. Gerry, I want to ask you how you first met Andy and what your impressions were.
Well, my first encounter with Andy was an interview at Fairchild R&D back in the spring of 1966. Ted Jenkins and I came up to be interviewed for jobs. And I was ushered into Andy's office. And I think before I could even sit down, he started a major oral exam on semiconductor physics, which lasted probably half hour, 45 minutes. And so then we left, and a few weeks later, we got a job offer. And so I must have passed the exam. But I turned down the job offer and decided to stay in school for a while longer. And then didn't really run into him again until I got a job offer from Intel in 1969.
So you were at Caltech at that time?
Yes.
Yeah. So you also had a relationship, like many people, with Andy outside of work. And your place up at the Delta was a famous one. And many of us would visit there. Can you tell us about Andy visiting and something that gave you an insight into Andy there?
Well, I think it was pretty clear to everybody that Andy had near zero mechanical skills. And so he came out in his new boat. And when he was getting ready to leave, or had trouble getting it started or something. And so where's the engine? Well, let's open up the back of the boat. And then he started asking questions. Well, is that the engine? Well, yeah. What about that? It's attached to the engine. I said, Andy, that's your Cuisinart for your toilet. But we got the thing started and off he went back home.
So was Andy a water skier?
I'm sorry?
Was Andy a water skier? Did he water ski out there with you?
Actually, I think he did. We used to do a lot of water skiing out at the Delta, but I don't recall any specific instances of that. Maybe less to remember.
Well, my recollection is he was always willing to try about anything, whether it be water skiing or snow skiing or tennis or riding a scooter. Let's get back to work. You ran a major part of Intel for quite a while, first technology development, and then all of the production capabilities. And tell us about your interface with Andy in that role.
Well, the most interesting things were always the regular meetings to get budgets and capital approved. And that was always somewhat of an inquisition with in a cat and mouse game, if I could say that. He finally got the finance guys to do a little spying for him before the meeting so he knew where to look. And one time we were trying to buy lithography equipment, and the lead time on lenses was enormous, 1.5 years. And so I decided just to start ordering lenses in case we needed the equipment later. And of course, the finance guys sold me out. And Andy gets all upset and he said, "You're buying the damn things a piece at a time, so you don't have to ask my permission anymore." Well, if I have to, that's what we'll do.
Do you have any other stories that you might tell us about what happened at work, or experiences or things you learned from Andy at work?
Sorry, trouble hearing you.
I said, do you have any other stories about what happened at work, about any lessons you might have learned or interesting experiences?
Well, as you know, Andy started taking the senior management team off-site once a year for management training. And that always really impressed me that, one, he wanted to learn himself and that he wanted us to learn how to manage. And then, of course, we'd pick up things like that 2x2 matrix and some basic management skills, which we then had to teach to people that worked for us. And somehow that always seemed really impressed me, because I think it showed that he wanted us to be successful too, instead of just him being the one guy that knew how to do things.
I think probably he always had a propensity towards education and training, and he even showed that with his work with Stanford afterwards. But I think probably one of the things he often said was that the best way to learn something is to teach it. So he wanted us all to be teachers, didn't he?
Now,
So next, Next on the agenda, we've got Jack Carsten. Jack probably worked with Andy less than the two people we've talked to or three people we've talked to so far. But he also had an interesting relationship with Andy. Jack, I'm going to ask you the same question. How did you and where did you first meet Andy, and what were your impressions?
I was recruited to join Intel from TI. I was running the MOS division at TI at the time, which wasn't a very big deal, but of course Intel wasn't a very big deal either. And Ed Gelback invited me out to his lovely home on Normandy Lane and had essentially a recruiting dinner. And first thing you know, in pops surprise guest number one, which was Bob Noyce. And I had not met Bob before. Bob, for those of you that knew Bob, was infinitely charming, very personable, wanted to hear all about me and my family and why I might want to join Intel and all these nice things. And then guest number two, which was Andy Grove, popped in the door. And Andy started immediately grilling me about why TI wasn't doing very well in the DRAM business and a bunch of such questions. And if I recall, it digressed into a discussion about why NMOS was better than PMOS and the integrity of thin films and a few other rather technical items. And once Andy had figured out that I wasn't some sales flake like Mike Markula, who I was replacing, or Ed Gelback, who he tolerated, but was contemptuous of his technical background. And then once he'd cleared me as somebody that knew what they were talking about, then we had a nice discussion and had good discussion about where Intel was going.
So, but you weren't quite convinced yet at that, and you went back to Houston, where you're living and working. And tell us about your decision-making process and how you decided to come to Intel.
Well, I was having a wine tasting party with a bunch of oil people who were actually former Californians, and this was about, I don't know, 8 or 9 o'clock at night. All of a sudden the phone rang in the middle of my party, and it was Andy Grove. And he was calling from the ski slopes. And in typical Andy fashion, Jack, tonight is the night you were supposed to tell us whether you're coming to Intel. What have you decided? And I said, oh, I haven't decided yet. The night's not over. And so we had a little discussion, and then I ended up, after the party was over, walking around the streets of Houston until 2 a.m. I finally came home and jumped in bed, and my wife turned to me and said, well, what did you decide? And I said, we're going to California. And so that was how I ended up deciding to come.
So was Casey happy about that?
She was delighted. She didn't like Houston, and she thought it was terrific, and it was.
Great. And how many years were you there at Intel?
I was there for 13 years, and one of the things, I think Gerry Parker mentioned it, but one of the things that I thought was really a terrific characteristic of Andy was that training employees is oftentimes delegated to the personnel department, and the material is not very good, and so forth and so on. And Andy had a completely different approach to things. The courses were designed by himself and the senior management, and then to the entire employee base, they were delivered by all the VPs. And, you had to cut enough time in your calendar to say you were assigned to a couple of courses, maybe, 15 days, you spent a half day lecturing. And, one of my specialties that some of you may remember was what we call constructive confrontation.
Yeah, we all remember that, Jack. It's interesting that Jack is the person on this panel that has the least amount of tenure with Andy, and that was 13 years. And that says something about Andy itself. Next, I'd like to go to Tom Dunlap. Tom had a long career with Andy with various amounts of interaction that started out at Intel in fairly early days and wound up going into the work in the foundation, the Moore Foundation. So Tom, tell us when and how did you first meet Andy and what were your impressions of Andy at that time?
Yeah, well, first of all, I wasn't hired by Andy. I was like employee 4,000 something. But I met him, I was a young product engineer at Intel. And I met him, it was very short actually, because it was in a meeting and the meeting people weren't all there. And so after 5 minutes, Andy left, but the meeting had to be rescheduled, and it gets rescheduled. And Andy says, okay, is everybody here? He says, we have only a certain amount of time in this life. And you didn't waste your time last week. You wasted my time. And I resent that. And I assume that it'll never happen again. And then he slams down this hand on the table for emphasis. And then Les walks in late.
So Tom, were you ever late after that?
I was never late. And I think it really shows how Andy was right. It was important to be on time. And that's why time is, being on time for meetings is always important at Intel.
Yeah, that's a lesson I think we all learned, and hopefully we all keep practicing. So you moved from being a product engineer and went to law school and became a lawyer at Intel, and you were involved with Andy in the days of antitrust concerns, et cetera. Tell us about your interactions with Andy at that point in time.
Yeah, I remember this one-on-one when I was general counsel. Now we're in the mid 80s. And Andy starts it off by saying, I don't want you to be defensive, which all of you know means you're in trouble for something. And he says, Tom, I know, and he had a very good insight. And he said, I think the 386 is going to be a very important product, very successful. And I know you have an antitrust compliance program, but I want to have the world's best. But I don't want it to be like IBM, where you scare everybody so that they have to come to the legal department before they do anything. I want you to have a training program. He says, you used to be a product engineer, the idea of guard band. You teach people that there's a guard band between what's legal and what isn't, and they should be able to still be aggressive Intel employees and stay on the legal side of the line. And then the other thing is, of course, he backed that up. He made it clear to everybody in the company that he was behind this, and that resulted in a very cooperative relationship between legal and everyone else, every other department, particularly, sales and marketing.
Yeah, that we all walked that tight line under Andy's leadership and direction, didn't we? You went on actually to have a relationship with Andy beyond that with the foundation. So first of all, how many years were you at Intel?
I was at Intel 31.
31 years, yeah. So a long, long time. But then you had a relationship beyond that with the foundation. Tell us about your relationship with Andy and how that worked with the Grove Foundation.
Yeah, first Andy asked me to do a few licensing deals for the foundation, actually. But then he got me more involved in managing some of the projects. Kinetics was like a subsidiary of the Grove Foundation, that funded research into Parkinson's disease. But Andy wouldn't just give them university money and say, go do good things. He would set up a project, would have milestones, it would have key results, and they'd have to, meet the key results if they wanted to get future funding. So mostly my job was, managing some of these programs. But I remember one time we went out to lunch and we got talking about how does Andy deal with Parkinson's disease? And he explained to me that he had a very rigorous exercise program. He had this set of medications that he'd take, and he'd tweak them from time to time to try to limit the ability limit what the disease had on his physical capabilities. But at one point he says to me, he says, Tom, this disease affects my physical abilities. I have some limitations, but as long as it doesn't affect my mental capacity, I consider it a nuisance. So here's a guy who considers a very debilitating disease basically a nuisance that he was going to fight to the best of his ability.
Thank you very much, Tom. Our next guest is Leslie Dorrison. Some people remember her from Intel, but she's probably best known for her activity as running the Grove Foundation. So if we could bring Leslie up, that'd be great. And quick question, Leslie. Tell us about the beginning of the foundation. And you're on mute, so we'll just.
I'm on mute. I just want to say one thing. For the very first time in the pandemic, my internet completely went down, and I am in Andy's office. That's a copy of his IRC refugee, papers behind me. So I think it's kind of fortuitous.
It really is. So tell us about the founding of the foundation, when and who and how did that get started?
The foundation was actually founded by Eva back in 1986. There's a couple people here who can correct me. It grew and became staffed probably more in the 2000s. They started hiring staff. Originally, it was really a family function where the family gathered around the table and decided who to give to, and then it became bigger and more of a staff foundation. I joined in, I think, 2006.
2006. So Andy brought some of his management philosophy to the foundation. So can you tell us a story about that? I think we may have an image ready to show.
Sure, and just a little background. The foundation really highlights another side of Andy. The foundation was founded on the principles of equal rights, freedom from discrimination, everyone should have access to basic needs, economic opportunity. We give our money with equity lens. So it highlights a different part of Andy, which was the immigrant and seeking to make sure everybody had opportunity and there was no discrimination. But he also brought a little bit of Intel. And I can see that the matrix is up there. So we also were managed with a 2x2 matrix, and all the Intel people are kind of laughing, but ours was different. So we called it our LPSO model, and it stood for leverage. So what is the ROI of this grant we're making? Scalability, how do we scale this idea? Do we start small and have it grow? What's the personal involvement? You can see that up on the top. He really wanted passion to drive the foundation. So if you look at our focus areas, they're really the passions of various family members. And the one that used to get me in trouble, the O stood for orphan. And then occasionally I would have a conversation with somebody who would think that we were helping children without parents. But it really meant, just like in business, looking for the opportunity. Where is the good idea, the important issue that really isn't attracting a lot of philanthropic dollars or a lot of investment? And so, to the credit of the foundation, we were one of the first foundations to focus on what are now called dreamers, 15 years ago when it was just starting, people were starting to realize there were these children who had grown up here and couldn't work or go to college. Anyway, so that's a little bit about the foundation.
So Leslie, if I could jump back in time when you were still an employee at Intel, your husband was in sales, you had an interaction with Andy. Tell us about it.
Oh, so my joke is I started at Intel in 1988 as an RCG, and there was a Intel winter party. And I have my boyfriend, who's now my husband, was from the East Coast, and he had worked at actually an accounting firm, and he actually owned a tuxedo. So he decided that this was a winter formal, and so he would wear his tuxedo. So my first interaction with Andy was he walked up to my boyfriend and I, looked at him, looked down at his outfit, looked across the room and said, well, it's you, me, and the head waiter. They were the only 3 people in Texas. And my husband never wore it again, ever, in any form.
Tells you something about Andy's humor. Next, we have a video we would like to show. And Steve, if you could cue that up, a special video that we'd like to show at this point in time. Go ahead, Steve.
Andy Grove was a mentor, a friend. And as we come up on the anniversary of his passing, it's a sad day, but it's also a glorious day for us to remember this great man. I remember some of my mentoring sessions with him, how he would just grind on the details and just force me to be better. I sometimes joke that mentoring with Andy Grove was like going to the dentist without Novocaine. He was tough, he was hard, but he made me better. I think for all of those who've had the chance to interact with him, you know that he made you better. He made us better, and he made this company better. As I come to be the CEO of Intel, I do it in Andy's memory. I can honestly tell you, if it wasn't for his influence on my life, I wouldn't be in this role today. I wouldn't be where I am today. And as I come to lead this next chapter, I feel like I've taken the baton from Noyce, Moore, and Andy, and it's my opportunity to run this leg of the race, to help restore Intel to be the greatest semiconductor company of all time, to be the manufacturing prowess, to be the technology leader, and to help this company set the pace in the globe for the key technologies of the future. That's why I've taken this job. And I simply say, as we remember his passing today, that, yeah, I'm doing this job in honor of Andy. And Andy, as you look down on us today, my hope, my prayer is that I do it well in your honor. Thank you, Andy, for all that you've done for me and all that are listening here today.
Thank you. And now we have a special guest. If Stevie would bring up our special guest, the new president of Intel, Pat Gelsinger. How are you, Pat?
Well, I'm a little bit teary after watching that. Man, that was hard.
We were all teary when we saw that. That was such a great tribute. Tell me, when did you first meet Andy, and what was your impression of him when you first met him?
Well, you know, I had given an update, and you might remember I was in charge of taping out the 386, and I had to give an update to MCM. And there was more noise, Grove, right? And I was just like fearful, but the computers weren't working. You might remember my Amdahl machines turned into IBM machines, and they were crashing. And, you know, and I basically yelled at MCM and said, if you don't fix these blanking computers, we're not getting the 386 out the door. Well, a little bit bravado for this young kid. My phone rings about a week later. And, you know, I was working on the 386, didn't want to be interrupted. And finally I pick up the phone. I say, who is it? And the voice comes back, Andy. I said, Andy who? Right? And he says, Andy Grove. And I just, you know, I almost went paralytic at the time. Right? And he says, he starts shelling me with questions. What do you read? What do you study? What are your career ambitions, et cetera? And I'm just like, you know, it was one of those moments with Andy. He says, lousy answers. Be in my office in a week with better ones. And that began a mentoring relationship that literally continued almost till the day of his passing. And, you know, it's one of those moments in time where, and I know so many of you can tell those stories where Andy would reach down right across layers, orgs, time, anything right? And pick out people that he chose to invest in. And I just feel so honored that I was one of those people that he chose to invest in that way.
Thank you, Pat. We all learned a lot from Andy, and I'm sure you did, and you referred to that. But can you tell us sort of what, I don't know if you could do this, what the most important thing you learned from Andy, or a couple most important things?
Well, one of the things that I always just deeply admired about Andy was his absolute insistence on finding the answer, right? And if you were 95% right, you were still wrong, right? You had to go all the way for a deep understanding. And, some of the legendary meetings between Grove and Gates, I was in the meeting, right? And you always had the view that you had two of the smartest people that existed in the industry at the time. With Grove, you knew that he was pursuing the right. With Gates, you never knew what he was up to, right? And to me, seeing that contrast, and it's just given to me, that, I want Intel to be this company on my, leg of leadership here that is pursuing the right, pursuing the best, and creating technologies that truly are touching every human on the planet. And, and that influence from Andy carries with me in so many ways to this day.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for that. So, and I'm very grateful for the work you did. Behind me, you're going to see the layout of the 486 signed by you, Pat.
I got one on my wall too at home, but today I actually happen to be on campus.
Very good. So back at Intel after all these years, tell us what it's like to be back at Intel.
Well, in some ways I view it like I took an 11-year vacation. Right. And learned a lot, now being a CEO for a while, living in the software industry, learning about other cultures and what it looks like. But in some ways, it's like I never left. Right. I walk in, I'm seeing people that may be a little bit more gray and, so on, but it's just like yesterday. And, and I've been so excited to be able to come back into the company, hit the ground running. And obviously, you might have seen we had some big announcements yesterday, right, around our manufacturing, IDM 2.0, leaning into foundry, major new capital expansions, because, we have gone through a period where we stumbled and had some rough periods. And, I'm just, extremely anxious to move us forward very quickly and, as rapidly as possible, put Intel back as that industry technology driving company. And boy, it's just been like the energy that's been released in the last 5 weeks has been really spectacular. And it's really an honor to be back home doing that.
That's great. I have to say that being outside of Intel, that I see that as well. The common thing I hear is that Pat's the best guy possible for the job. So we're all happy that you're back, and we're all rooting for you to continue and to be successful, and for Intel to be and continue to be the greatest semiconductor company in the United States and regain its position as the greatest one in the world. So is there anything else you want to add before? I know you've got a very busy schedule, Pat, and we don't want to hold you up too long. We're so happy you could join us today. Was there anything you want to say before leaving?
Well, a few of you, maybe, retirement ain't such a great gig. And, it's, we'll happily, bring a few of you experienced folks back to help me out here a little bit, but overall, we have had a number of people coming back to the company, right, because we have had too much talent flow out. So I will say, not entirely in jest, come home, we got some good work to get done here. A lot of things are happening quickly. And, I'll just say as CEO for the company now, I do thank the Alumni Association. It's been, this continuing force that, once you get Intel in your blood, it's like there. And I'm so grateful for what Bruce and the alumni team have done over the years, because it is something that, I'll just say people want us to succeed, not just the alumni, but the people in the industry. They want us to be successful because we're that important for the world, for the industry, and our nation. So thank you so much. And I'll get back to making sure, my leg of this journey is a successful one.
Thank you so much for joining us, Pat. We really appreciate it. So we're going to turn now to question and answer. And you've got a question and answer button down in the lower right of your screen. And we're going to look for questions. So please enter your questions, and they're going to be fed to me so that I can wind up asking them. But one question we have here is that Andy started out as a great technologist, but he made a switch to being a great manager. And we're interested in any comments about that, how that happened. And probably some of the people that were there early, like Les and Gerry, probably have the best insight, but would one of the panelists like to respond to that question?
So it turns out he really was a student at heart. He, when he started taking on some managerial roles at Intel, he read every book he could find on management. And he came to love Peter Drucker. But he read all sorts of things, and he had notebooks full of notes that I wasn't aware of this until Richard Tedlow started to write his biography. But it was pretty amazing. I was impressed.
I'm sure that Les and Jack and Gerry all saw that, but I think those of us who were there at the time remember him bringing in all these management consultants, and he would have these management training sessions with people like Peter Drucker and other leaders in management philosophy, where we would go to Padaro Dunes or someplace else and spend time studying. And then always we got a job after that to come up with the training material and go teach that. I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to comment. Let's go ahead.
Yeah, Andy had first of all, Andy initially did not have much use for business school type thinking. And later on, I think he got more appreciative of some of the things that business schools could offer. But he was a very strong believer that when there was some knowledge somewhere, we ought to grab it, adapt it to our own need, and then teach it to our own staff. And that happened over and over again. And I remember one particular course, matrix management. It all happened because we brought somebody in by the name of Jay Galbraith, and he taught some of the course, and then we adapted it to our own situation and taught it all over Intel. And that happened over and over and over again.
It seemed like it was the same approach that Les, you told earlier about him with tennis and with skiing and everything that he pursued. Nothing was done half-heartedly, was it?
That's right. That's right. That's right.
One thing that I observed was he had a very special relationship with Ed Gelbach. And Ed Gelbach recruited many of the strong sales and marketing people to the company, including myself, Bill David Dow, Dave House, I don't know, the list goes on and on. And I think he was receptive to learning what that was all about. But the place he started from, and I can remember in the early days taking him to account meetings and so forth, it was rough going because he couldn't understand why a customer wouldn't want to buy the Intel product. It was so much better and so forth and so on. But he really did over time, took over sort of the sales and marketing executive role that had been held by Bob Noyce. And this was before Bob even passed on. And I think it was a remarkable sort of transformation for somebody that was basically a PhD scientist.
It was interesting watching him move from being the operations manager and technologist and then operation manager, and then eventually becoming the sales and marketing guy. Remember, he seated himself in the middle on the floor with the sales team and with the public relations team, part of a major transformation that happened. So I'll throw out another question that came in is people have talked about Grove's culture, the Grovian culture. And Pat talked about it and we all know about it, but do you have some stories that or information you'd like to share relative to the culture that he created at Intel?
You know, I think that he just really instilled a sense of discipline. Meetings started on time, ended on time. You say what you're going to do, and you did it. There was never anything, the checks in the mail, and then, you know, people forget about it. And I think one time I asked him about doing something for me. I don't even remember what it was. And a few days later, it was done. And I caught him. I said, I didn't expect you to do that. Most bosses wouldn't. And he said, I said, I was going to do it. And by God, I did it. And that's sort of his attitude. And that's what he expected of us.
Yeah, that's for sure. So another question came in that.
One thing I remember about
Go ahead, Tom.
risk-taking, Andy and risk-taking. And, you know, in the legal world, I mean, you go to trial, you never know what the jury's going to do. But it was always clear to me that if you had a reason, you had a good chance, you thought it through, and you explained it, even if you lost, Andy still appreciated you taking the risk if you made the right trade-offs.
Anybody else on the panel want to comment about the Grovian culture?
Grove was the culture.
If I may,
Yes, Les.
I think he had a unique ability to see things in its most simple, basic elements. And so when people obfuscated around the problem, like said, well, this is not as good as we would like to see, that was very frustrating to Andy. And he wanted to know, like, well, is it screwed up that we have to fix it, or is it good enough? You know, I mean, he wanted to really have simple answers to complex problems. And I think that's a strength, and that really drove organization to really solve problems.
So any other comments from the panel?
Well, I think the problem of being the CEO of a fast-growing, popular company is that the staff rapidly can become a house of mirrors, with everybody telling you what you want to hear. And Andy didn't like that at all. And he and I got along remarkably well for someone who was fairly sharp-tongued about what the situation was. But in general, that's why he went down several levels in the organization and picked out people like Gelsinger in a key position to find out what was really going on. And if you were blowing smoke up his tail end, you heard about it in a hurry. And he didn't have any tolerance for that at all.
You know, one question that came in is Andy was typically considered a tough taskmaster, and Pat had talked about that. But many of us saw a lighter side of Andy and a more personal side of Andy. And I'd like to hear from the panel examples of times when that part of Andy showed through.
Well, I remember Andy helped me understand how to have one-on-ones with my daughters. He said, it's not exactly the same as you have one-on-ones with me. He says, you know, you might want to, you know, go out to dinner with them. You don't need to have a specific agenda, but just have a nice one-on-one with them. And, you know, they still appreciate that today. And my grandkids love to have one-on-ones with me, but we don't have an agenda.
Thank you.
You know, Andy could be what you would call the consoling in chief. When you had to make a really lousy decision about something and you feel bad about it, you know, that was Andy who helped you think through and talk through. and gives you a little strength to make that hard decision?
So I think it's back in the 80s when the Intel had a really hard time and actually lost money 1 or 2 years. I remember there was Wired magazine. I don't know if anybody remembers that. I think that's what it was called. It used to come out every few months. And Andy came home during that time and he's trying to juggle how Intel's gonna muddle through this recession. And the magazine had, on the cover, had 2 older white-haired women on the cover. And he looked at it and he said, you know, I can't let people like this go. I can't lay them off. No, that could be my mother. So he struggled some more. And I guess he ended up coming up with the 125% solution, which I believe meant everybody had to work an extra 8 hours a week or something to help Intel get out of the recession. They didn't lay off, although they might have later, I don't know, but there were no layoffs at that point. And it was just like, okay, if everybody works harder, maybe we work ourselves out of this. And then I remember the party at the end when it seemed like the recession was over. And I still have a mug that says, I survived the 125% solution.
Well, that was before my time, so I always was interested in hearing that story. Les, do you have any stories to tell? Dave is trying to reconnect. He should be on within like 10 seconds.
Well, you know, I'm an old man. I forget most of the stories. I think.
I don't know. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. I think
now we can hear you.
So
Well,
I was kind of guiding the panelists on just waiting for you to come back. So they're talking about something. So I guess Dave is rejoining just via phone right now, which is great.
Yeah, I have to tell you that Comcast has failed us, but Verizon is still with us. So I'm able to connect my phone. I'm not sure what happened there. But let things continue here. It might be easier if you can ask the questions on that end.
I see one about the showers. And,
Okay, if we're looking at the Q&A versus the other questions, so which one are you talking about?
a question from Sue Kierkegaard. She says, my question is, I remember Andy saying we'll never have showers at Intel. And it was purely focused on work in those days, work-life balance. Did he make any comment to you as Intel culture changed with the times? Us old timers certainly remember 125% solution, 80% solution. I don't remember that one. Those were the inflection points in the company's history. I do remember he just didn't think people should be going out for a run in the middle of the day. They should be working. And he did come to change his mind. And well, most of you probably know that Intel did put in showers. And I still have a picture on my wall of Andy and Carlene
Ellis.
Carlene Ellis in old-fashioned bathing suits coming out of the shower. And I have a towel. I have a towel on which it says we will never have showers at Intel.
And
okay, so actually I have a memory of that. It's kind of weird for me to be talking from, so here I am. I'm just gonna say, I remember when Andy dedicated the fitness center, he said, here's to the dedication of the Andy Grove Memorial Fitness Center. And I almost fell off my chair. So he's also funny. So we can continue taking question. I'm gonna mute myself again. We have a question about, What was if anybody of you can answer this, about the 6 values on the back of the badge involving, and what Andy's role is in designing those 6 values that most of us remember from our days at Intel?
Yeah, well, I remember.
Quality.
Yeah, we had all those, but I think Andy's favorites was results orientation, risk taking, and constructive confrontation. I remember those 3. And the constructive confrontation part, he thought he really liked how Intel, or how legal interpreted that, because if let's say there's a meeting and the marketing people, they had it all rehearsed and so forth on what was going to happen, he would like just take the opposite side no matter what, just to get a discussion going. And what he liked about what we had done was he liked to see what we had with these mock trials where we actually had people take the other side of it. That was the extreme constructive confrontation in his view.
I think this might be out for all panelists, including you, Dave. Can you comment on Andy's relationship with Bob Noyes and Gordon Moore, if the Trinity, basically?
If I could comment on that, Andy absolutely worshipped Gordon. When Gordon spoke in executive staff, everybody was quiet. Everybody listened. And I think Andy had the ultimate confidence in Gordon. And Bob had 8 out of every 3 good ideas. And it was kind of a little bit contradicted Andy's complete focus on the most important thing. And so it wasn't always the closest relationship. He certainly had a lot of respect for what Bob could contribute. But, whenever Gordon spoke, I don't recall any kind of the disagreement that he had with all the rest of us about things. He seemed to be in agreement. Probably the one item that meant the most he wrote a book about, which is Only the Paranoid Survive, and his interaction with Gordon about what if they hired new people, new management here, what would they do? And his agreement there. But never did I see him show anything but ultimate respect for Gordon, even beyond what maybe he believed himself. More comments?
If I may add, this goes back to Fairchild. I remember Andy was at Fairchild R&D running a physics group working on some important surface technology, surface effects, and Gordon was running Fairchild R&D. Then Fairchild R&D was reorganized, with Andy becoming assistant general manager of R&D, sort of 2 in the box with Gordon. And I always had the feeling that Andy would follow Gordon anywhere. If Gordon decided to go start another company, I had the feeling Andy would want to be part of it.
And in fact, he did.
He did.
He did. When Gordon told him that he was leaving for Intel, he said, "I'm coming."
I think
Wait to be asked.
I think there's an interesting story that goes back to the Fairchild days, where Charlie Spork quit as VP of operations at Fairchild and started National Semiconductor. And Bob Noyce was the CEO. After that, Fairchild had just incredible problems. And it's one of the reasons that he and Gordon decided to form Intel. So, and Andy had a strong desire to become the CEO. And there wasn't room for Andy, Gordon, and Bob all at the top of the ladder. I think Bob recalled well what a disaster it was at Fairchild not to have a strong operation COO type. And so he stepped down to vice chairman, continued to be active, but then Andy became CEO, which is, of course, was his long-term dream and well, something he deserved.
But yet Andy was willing to do whatever it took, which was classic Andy. When Bob and Gordon went there, the obvious job was somebody in operations. It was clear that Bob was the sales and outside guy, and Gordon was the inside guy of the technology
Research guy, right.
at the time. And they needed somebody to run operations. And I remember Andy saying to me, you know, I'd never done that, but that's what needed to be done. So that's what I did. So Eva, a question from the audience here is, you seem to be quite informed about the various Intel programs. Did Andy use you as a sounding board for these issues?
Probably. I mean, we did talk about, I mean, you know, those were the things that were on his mind, and we talked about them a lot. Yeah, and I think I had a fairly superficial understanding of them, but enough, you know, and it was just enough to have some back and forth.
Yep. I remember the 125% solution was we all needed to work harder during a really bad time. And the 80% solution was we didn't want to lay off a lot of good people. And so we'd take a pay cut instead of reducing the size of the force. And Andy, those were both Andy programs that came out of
so there was a pay cut. Got it.
Yep. So you and Andy have two daughters. To get into the personal side of things with Robbie and Karen, but you also have a number of grandchildren. Are any of the descendants following in Andy's footsteps?
Well, not yet necessarily, but there are two mechanical engineers among them. And yeah, and then the others are going more for the liberal arts and stuff.
Okay,
actually we have an animal technology person, one who's going to possibly end up going to a vet school, although he first vowed how he would not do that.
Well, Karen started out in engineering and is now very much involved in the foundation. Isn't that true?
Yeah, Karen was a mechanical engineer.
Yeah.
But
she decided that wasn't for her.
No, I think for a long time she didn't think it was for her, and she really found her calling in the foundation and various activist roles.
Okay, we've just got about maybe 5 minutes left, but I'd like to open it up for the panel to recall remembrances of Andy, things that they remember about Andy, and just anybody want to go first?
One thing I thought was great about Andy that you and I discussed, Dave, in the executive staff meetings when it was expanded to include Les Vadasz and myself and Gene Flatt and some others, there was a tendency for people like Les and I to, shall we say, over-contribute. And one of Andy's secret and very respectful ways of dealing with this, which many of us remember, is he would rip off a small piece of paper. He would write down, you know, something like, "Jack, you're doing it again." He would fold it up, put my initials on it, and then he would pass it around the room to where it got to me or maybe to Les. And we'd open it up and, "Oh, I did it again." And yet he didn't raise his voice or, you know, cause any embarrassment in the room. It was just between you and him.
And we call those Grovograms, didn't we?
Right.
Yep. We got the Grovograms during executive staff. Little piece of paper, write a note with his red pen, fold it over, put your initials, and then it'd go round and around and around. And you all knew that Andy was saying something to one of us. And then the person would get it and open up and, oh yeah, And he was always right about it. That was his way of communicating. The other thing were the Grove Grams, where the red pen wrote on a memo, and he'd take something that would have been sent and he'd write a comment. Andy could say more things in less words than anybody I knew. For somebody where English was his second language, he could say more things in less words.
Good.
Well, I have to say, we didn't have the Grove Grams at the foundation, although we did have the red pen writing on things. But I think what I learned the most from Andy is to really be serious about your work, be prepared, show respect to grantees, deliver results, but don't take yourself seriously. And in some ways, he was a very humble, polite person. And in the middle of the worst time, he would just crack a horrible joke. He did not, I think we alluded to it with the shower and the towels. He did not mind being made fun of if he deserved it. And he thought humor was, an antidote to a really tough situation. And so I really appreciated that balance. And I think it's really reflected in the foundation, which takes a low profile and isn't really about putting its name on things, but really about solving problems. And so that's my learning.
We all remember ITEL Leads, the spoof on Intel Leads.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the early days, when ITEL went bankrupt, our friends would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry about your company going bankrupt." And we said, no, it's Intel, not ITEL. And so he picked up that the name, and it became ITEL Leads. And it made fun of Andy all the time.
And he was fine with that.
It was.
He actually loved it.
I still have some. I was actually had them in preparing for this. I looked through some of them.
So it was Intel Leads. It wasn't Wired.
Well, Intel Leads was the regular one. The regular publication was called Intel Leads, and I know it came out quarterly, but on April 1st every year.
I remember that.
Wasn't it Pam Palacci that put it, was kind of the brains behind it, but
it was
it
Pam,
came out in
Katie Wood.
Katie Woods, yep, the Marcom people. And they made fun of all of us. We all got butchered in there, but Andy particularly.
I never forget my picture with Cher on the front page of one of them.
And then there was the one during that really bad recession where they had Gordon and Bob, and maybe Andy, I don't know, sitting on the ground with a hat out asking for dollars.
Yeah, they had one where I was on the cover eating a cereal bowl of chips because we couldn't sell them.
And of course, Vadasz was always famous for his mixed metaphors and the picture of grabbing the ball by the horns.
Yeah.
I don't know what's wrong
We got
with
we got to grab the ball by the horns. So they had a picture of him.
Okay.
Well, I see we're coming up on the end of the hour here. We've all enjoyed telling these stories about Andy and remembering some of the many things we remember, and we could never do it all in an hour or an hour and a half. I want to thank all the people that were able to stay on. We still have, I got a message, we still have 400 people that are still on, and we have people from around the world and people who worked at Intel and people that didn't work at Intel. And some of the Intel locations overseas are taking the recording of this and will be replaying it and having their own remembrance of Andy Grove. So I think at this point in time, we can thank you all. It's our an hour and a half is up, and continue the stories about Andy. We all admire him. We all loved him, and we all miss him. Thank you.